Hello there. Today I'm taking a look at a wine that is arguably one of New Zealand's top Cabernet Merlot blends. The wine is from the Church Road Winery and it's their Tom 2020 Cabernet Sauvignon Merlot. The winery at Church Road was established in 1897. At that stage it was called Taradale Vineyards. But in 1921, a young man, a 14-year-old called Tom McDonald, joined the team at the winery. And he must have been quite an exceptional young man because 5 years later he was the manager there. In fact, at one stage, not long after, he bought the winery and ran it for several years. Alas, the lack of capital prevented him from continuing his ownership. Instead, he ended up running the winery for the Australian winemaking family, the McWilliams family. McDonald is famous because in 1949 he released what was the first commercial Cabernet Sauvignon produced in the Hawke's Bay. And the Cabernets he made, particularly in the 1950s, were really very famous. They were wines that were seen to stand the test of time. They were truly age-worthy. This was something that at that stage was quite unusual for the New Zealand wine industry. McDonald stayed involved at the Church Road Winery until his death in 1987, making him a huge figure both in New Zealand's wine industry and in the Hawke's Bay region. And this particular wine, the Cabernet Merlot, launched in 1997, was initially created as a tribute to Tom McDonald. The range has since been extended. They now make a Chardonnay and a Syrah in the same range. And these are Church Road's flagship wines. 2020 was an exceptional vintage for Hawke's Bay. It was hot, it was dry, there was drought for most of the growing season, certainly through until after harvest, so there was no pressure from rot. The vines from which this wine was made were irrigated using a system of limited deficit irrigation, where water was applied from dripper pipes. Moisture was monitored to ensure that sufficient water was applied to ensure that the vines could continue to function, but not so much that it caused excess vigour. Management of the canopy and the ripening of the fruit was very carefully monitored, starting with shoot thinning, then with fruit thinning, with declumping. They trimmed the canopy, they cleared leaves from around the fruit zone to ensure all the fruit was exposed to the sun. So essentially everything was done to ensure that the bunches were evenly spaced along the rows and were all well exposed to the sunlight. Making sure that everything was well spaced out ensured lovely balanced fruit was harvested. Harvest is done entirely by hand, very selectively, any damaged or unripe fruit being rejected at that stage. The wine is a blend of 69% Cabernet Sauvignon with 31% Merlot. Now, slightly confusingly, it comes from two vineyards, and it actually comes 61% from the Redstone vineyard in Bridge Parr and 39% from the Gimlet Road vineyard in the Gimlet Gravels district. The Redstone vineyard on the Bridge Parr district is one of the warmest vineyards in Hawke's Bay. And this is achieved because the site within Bridge Parr where it sits is actually sheltered from cool winds coming down from the hills above by Roy's Hill, a geographical feature that blocks the passage of those cooling winds. So this is an exceptionally warm portion within the Bridge Parr Triangle. Not surprisingly, the soils here are rich in iron and they're very old, fractured, grey, wacky soils. The style of wines that these creates tends to have lovely, elegant perfume and good freshness. The Gimlet Road vineyard, on the other hand, tends to give more sort of concentration and richness. These are incredibly free-draining alluvial gravels, which are low in moisture content and very devigorating for that reason. In the run-up to harvest, the fruit was being analysed every 2 or 3 days just to make sure that picking happened at exactly the point that was wanted, with sufficient sort of elegance and yet power combined in the portions. Each different plot was harvested separately according to what was needed from that, and as I say, there was a high degree of selection going on during picking. The fruit was destemmed, crushed and immediately inoculated. There was no pre-fermentation, cold soak or anything like that. It went into tank where fermentation was allowed to go up to 34 degrees. So that the idea of that being to extract plenty of colour and to extract ripe tannins. That's quite a warm fermentation. Maceration continued after fermentation, with the wine staying with the skins for up to 4 weeks in total. This was monitored and aeration was applied to try and stabilise the colour, to integrate the tannins and to provide lifted aromas. When it was judged ready, the wine was drained into small French oak barrels, 73% of which were new, and it stayed there for 18 months. It completed its malolactic conversion in these barrels and then stayed in barrel for an entire period of 18 months. At blending, there was a rigorous selection of those barrels that were to make their way into the Tom wine. Only the best and most suitable lots were included. Following blending, the wine was racked off its lees. It wasn't filtered, it wasn't fined, and it wasn't cold stabilised, with the idea that nothing could diminish the wine's flavours or aromas. So let's have a look at the wine and see what we make of it, shall we? This is a virtually opaque purple to ruby red. It loses very little colour to a purple rim. I certainly can't see through it. As I'm swirling it, it's forming tears on the side of the glass, as I'd expect from a wine that's going to have plenty of extract and has 14.5% alcohol according to its label. The aromas have a lovely cassis and red currant freshness. There are some hints of darker plum. There are also notes of cedar and hints of graphite as well, perhaps. But there's a clean, precise set of dark fruit perfumes there. So let's taste. The wine is of course completely dry. It's got a plentiful supply of very fine tannins. There's plenty of cedariness that does take over at the beginning of the palate. However, there's plenty of juicy blackcurrant and cassis fruit there in the front of the mouth, backed up by sort of dark plum, dams and bullace sort of notes. There's a real note of vanilla comes through at one stage. And then there are more of those sort of cedar-derived sweet spices, sort of cinnamon. There are hints of leather. There's a touch of graphite to the finish. There's a little bit of licoricey concentration on the finish. The mid-palate is rich and round. This is relatively full-bodied. It's very well structured, and yet at the same time the richness of the fruit is stopping the tannins, although they are drying and they have good grip, from being too astringent. Once we've got past the attack of the wine where they were quite present, the fruit is now opening out and giving much more sort of roundness. There's a sort of a blackcurrant pastel note on the back palate, almost as if there's a touch of glycerol there. Yes, that sort of roundness is evident on the back palate, and yet at the same time there's still that freshness. There's almost a slight leafy note to the cassis. This is almost in a sort of a fresh Bordeaux-like sort of style. It's got lovely, clean Cabernet flavours, and yet it is filled out behind by those sort of more sort of plummy, rich Merlot notes that's giving it a lovely depth. The wine is very young. I've double decanted this to try and allow it to show its aromas. I'm sure that those tannins, which really rather close up the front palate, will smooth with 5 to 10 years of age, and that's when this wine will really come into its own. But this is a beautifully concentrated, wonderfully balanced wine. I mean, the way that the fruit is balancing the tannins is very impressive indeed. The texture is, it has grip, but there's a wonderful smooth harmony to the texture that spreads right to the back palate throughout the wine. There's very little standing out as being in any way awkward, even though this is such a young wine. So yes, I'm impressed. I think this is a high quality wine. I think it's well worth putting down to age. It's not a cheap wine, but actually in the context of the quality you're looking at, the price does seem appropriate. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed the tasting. If you found it interesting, please do consider sharing it with your friends. Do hit the like button, that would be great. If you've got any comments, please leave those below. We'd love to hear what you think about the wine, the tasting, or anything else that we're doing. Please do consider following us on YouTube. That would be fantastic. But most importantly, I do hope you'll manage to make the time to join us at another online tasting sometime very soon. Thank you again. Bye now.